Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Mesa Refuge. My name's Susan Tillett. I'm the executive director of this wonderful writers retreat in Point Reyes Station, California. I want to acknowledge at the opening of this gathering that we are on Coast Miwok land at just feet from the San Andreas Fault. Our tagline is writing at the edge, and it has a whole new meaning these days. We are on the edge. I also want to acknowledge that these are such changing times, challenging times on so many levels, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. So I would invite you just to take a deep breath, to embrace that complexity, and to just let yourself be present, mind as well as heart, for the next 90 minutes that we're going to spend together. I'm here in the gathering room of the Mesa Refuge. This is the place where we come together at the end of each residency to hear a little bit of new work that's been created by those who've just been in residence. And sometimes we invite our alums back when they have new work to share with our larger community. And that's what today was originally designed to be, a picnic, in fact. We've had the date on the calendar for months, and I can't tell you how many times it's all changed. The format has changed, we've kept the date, and we wanted to keep the opportunity for you to hear from some of our alums who just have really very interesting things to say. One thing I never thought I'd be doing when 2020 dawned was to be providing tech tips for Zoom, but that's my next job here. This is a new way of connecting for the Mesa Refuge and for all of us to be together. So please be patient and be flexible and maintain your sense of humor. This is a webinar rather than a meeting, so we don't see everybody who is in the audience. You will only see the two hosts and the four panelists, and we will be coming and going in a veritable ballet of choreographed movements navigated by Kamala Tully and Kira Epstein, who are residing in a parallel universe behind the screen. And we're very grateful to them because a great deal depends on what they're doing. We encourage you to use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you go down to the bottom, you'll see where it says chat. And you're welcome to add comments and particularly encouraged to ask questions when the speakers speak. If we have time at the end, we will address them. And when you are chatting, please choose all panelists and participants so that everyone can see your comments. And if you have technical difficulties, I suggest you just send a message to Mesa Refuge, which is Kamala, and either she or Kira will jump on and see if they can help you out of whatever corner you've gotten into. Okay, here we go. For more than 20 years, the Mesa Refuge has been providing time, space, and community for writers grappling with the most pressing needs of our time. So it's no surprise that every day when I get up, I see our alums on the front lines of all that's going on in the world. They are articulating their personal perspective, and they are also reaching to find more universal perspectives that are so helpful. So today, we've invited 4 alums, all of whom I've had the great pleasure to know when they were in residence, to join us today to share their work. They are James Bell, Sujatha Baliga, Byron Hurt, and Erwin Keller. But before we get to them, I want to introduce you to someone very special, my co-host, Elaine Allenson. Elaine is a speaker and a writer. She's a several-time Mesa alum, and she's currently our board president. And in that capacity, she is my most excellent partner, leading the Mesa through challenging times. When Elaine joined the board in 2017, she told us that she came with a clear agenda to make the Mesa Refuge a more truly diverse place, raising up the voices of writers and activists of people of color. And today's program is a great reflection of this richer view. Elaine?
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you to all who are joining us today. And special thanks to Kira and to Kamala for putting us on the air so beautifully. As Susan mentioned, when we first planned our alumni picnic, the only storms we were worried about were thunderstorms. We had no idea that we would be gathering in this stormy, dangerous, difficult, and yet somehow hopeful moment. We're facing not one, but two pandemics, and they have some things in common. They are both lethal, they are both widespread, and they both take a brutally disproportionate toll on people of color. But while the coronavirus came upon us suddenly, the epidemic of institutional racism and the state using its power from police to prisons to suppress, oppress, and silence African Americans has been with us since before the founding of this country, as has courageous resistance to that repression. What is different, I hope, we all hope, that we are in a season of change, of real transformation, of a tectonic shift ignited by the righteous anger of people in the streets demanding change. We cannot but be heartened by the massive continuing protests demanding justice for the murders of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, and so many before them, and support for the movement for Black lives. And what a moment it is. Millions of people of all backgrounds, but led by people of color and young people, are in the streets in all 50 states, in 800 cities and towns on 6 continents. Many local governments and even members of Congress are now proposing concrete ways to redirect money from police departments to address housing, hunger, health, and education. Cities are enacting bans on chokeholds and on no-knock warrants. And there's powerful symbolic changes too. The military and even NASCAR have barred the Confederate flag. Statues of Confederate generals are being toppled, and a statue of a 17th century slaveholder that had been in Bristol for more than 100 years now lies at the bottom of an English river. Today's bold demonstrators have created the space for a transformation of our society. They're creating space for the demands for social justice to breathe. There's an urgency to this moment. There's also a deep awareness that many activists for justice have been toiling in the trenches for a long time, and that today's energy is built on their decades of work, often out of sight. We are humbled and honored to offer Mesa Refuge as a place where writers and thinkers and activists committed to social justice, economic equity, and the future of our planet can work and reflect and share their voices with the world. Mesa Refuge writers have often been harbingers of change. Many of you who've been at residence at Mesa or have visited us there know that in addition to the vast library that you see behind Susan in the gathering room, there are also a random selection of books on the small shelves in the bedrooms and the writing sheds. Some left by earlier residents, perhaps some planted by our founder, Peter Barnes. On one of my stays at Mesa Refuge, I found several books by James Baldwin, an author I had not read since college, and I decided to reread them. I was amazed at his brilliant writing, at his prescience. And today I remembered his quote, "Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have." Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. So today we are thrilled to welcome 4 Mesa alums who are just as ferocious in daring to fight that enemy. And please help me welcoming them. Our first reader will be James Bell. James, can you turn on your audio and video? James is my fellow Mesa Refuge board member, a 2016 alum, and he is the founder and executive director of the Haywood Burns Institute, based in Oakland, with a national presence. Since 2001, James has spearheaded a national movement to address racial and ethnic disparities in the administration of the youth justice system. And speaking of prophetic voices, James has trained thousands of human services professionals and community members on a vision of well-being as the most effective way to achieve community safety. Please welcome James Bell.
Thank you, Elaine. Appreciate those remarks. And I want to thank everybody that's taking time on a Sunday to join in this readings and these conversations. There has been a significant amount of brilliant commentary and analysis about the latest series of incidents rooted in institutional racism and state-sanctioned violence. I'm not sure why, but something about the George Floyd, Chris Cooper, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and then we could add Rashard last night. Those incidents have struck a different, hopeful chord. Yet, I remain cautious about this time being different. One can always hope. But what is not different, however, in these events is that they must eventually be viewed through the prism of whiteness and the institutions it has constructed to protect the myths about white superiority. Thus, every facet of our civil society, from education, health, transportation, housing, etc., must negotiate the whiteness metric. And that metric requires that everything be measured against whiteness for value, pedigree, and worth. Thus, white supremacy is sewn into the fabric of every endeavor of American life. It is in our societal DNA. It is in the air we breathe, the stories told, and the privileges that come with hundreds of years of free labor on stolen land. Indeed, the longer we live in a society steeped in whiteness being the superior way of being, the more invisible privilege becomes. The role of government in all of our villages, towns, and cities is to protect those privileges zealously. And law enforcement is the first line of racialized privilege protection against those deemed dangerous. It is the protection of the white privilege industry necessary to maintain itself that is responsible for the policing as we know it in every city and county in this nation. The protection of white privilege and the industry that is required to maintain it. In fact, it is so important that the city you live in probably spends more than half of its tax dollars on the administration of justice alone. Indeed, it is that privilege that Miss Amy Cooper weaponized by calling the police because, quote, she was being threatened by an African-American man, end quote. She understood all too well what our societal mandate to law enforcement is. Whiteness has a status that is paramount, and Blackness must be controlled severely because it is scary, violent, and dangerous. No matter how one tries to pretty it up, whiteness is considered order, and Blackness is considered chaos, disorder, and must be controlled. Therefore, policing adheres to these rules regardless of the color or gender of the chief, the power of oversight bodies, or any other thing that we try to create to reform them. A review of civil disturbances in the 50s with dogs and fire hoses, to the 60s with Watts, Detroit, and Harlem, and more recently with Rodney King, Freddie Gray, and now George Floyd, has one common denominator: police misconduct. In each of those cases, Black folks have tried to tell the larger society that we are suffocating and traumatized by the instructions you have given law enforcement for your safety. Through it all, policing has been given almost carte blanche to do whatever it is seen as necessary to make sure that, quote, order is maintained. As a result, the law enforcement industry has demanded military-style weapons and equipment that have turned our communities into battlefields. Unfortunately, too many elected and appointed officials have given in to those demands for more lethality, claiming that it is what we, their constituents in the greater civil society, that's what we want them to do. They say that they are doing it in our names. Law enforcement has gained so much power that it is fair to ask, are they too big to fail? Who can make them account for their actions? Any suggestion of reining in their power is seen as un-American, and anyone daring to challenge their practices are too often belittled or marginalized. Given power, equipment, and society's permission, it is no wonder that Black bodies have piled up, and sometimes in full view. Then, on May 25th, 4 Minneapolis police officers participated in the murder of a restrained George Floyd, asphyxiating him by kneeling on his neck for almost 9 minutes. The chilling and calm visage of Officer Derek Chauvin as he murders Mr. Floyd is visual proof that he believed he had society's permission to extinguish this Black life in order to maintain, quote, safety. And history has shown his use of power to murder Mr. Floyd has been permitted again and again and again. So after seeing the stark reality of the policing we have built and too often sanctioned, voices that have remained silent in the past are beginning to speak up and ask for change. However, real-world concrete suggestions of alternatives to policing as we know it are few and far between. Heretofore, we have seen the ineffectiveness of tools and technologies that try to improve policing. Those include cultural competence training, implicit bias training, procedural justice practices, body cameras. All of them have not been transformative because they ignore one fact. And that fact is that policing was built to maintain the cultural superiority of whiteness and punish those in society who are deemed as, quote, the other. And the very definition of the other in these United States is Black folk. Therefore, nothing will change until we give the law enforcement industry a new mission. We need to imagine how to reduce their footprint while providing for well-being in our communities. 300 years of structurally racist social control will not be eliminated overnight and must be thought through carefully, regardless of slogans and political posturing. First, we begin with a co-design of this new mission that includes victims and perpetrators. It may seem impossible now, but some city is going to step up and examine how community well-being can be maintained without custody control and suppression as its fundamental approach, and take the courage to develop an alternative system that doesn't just include defunding police, but creates another way of well-being for our communities. Mr. Floyd's very public murder presents an opportunity to move in that direction. It is an open question to me whether we as a society will take it. If we do not, we can guarantee that we will be back here again and in the very near future. Aren't we better than this? Aren't we smart and humane enough to imagine and implement ways that promote community well-being equitably, and fairly? Are we trapped by a history that subjugates one group over another? I hope not, and I look forward to getting to work. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'm always, I find it remarkable when people can be so articulate at moments like this. James sent out that statement recently to the board of the Mesa Refuge, and I knew immediately that we wanted to share it with you. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing that today. Okay, next up we have Sujatha Baliga. Sujatha is an attorney and a restorative justice practitioner working in the area of survivor-centered, I'm never going to get this right, survivor-centered restorative justice alternatives to legal interventions, which means helping crime survivors to heal, holding those who have caused them harm accountable, and breaking the cycles of recidivism and violence. Sujatha was with us in 2018, I think. And I was actually sitting right here in this very spot on this couch, her final evening, when she read us the introduction to her book. And it was one of those electrifying moments when I knew I was hearing true inspiration, and it has stayed with me. And when she was named MacArthur Fellow in 2019, I just stood up and cheered because she really deserves it. And we are so proud that she's an Mesa alum and so glad that she's joining us today. Sujatha?
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be joining you all today, and really just an incredible honor to go after James Bell, who has taught me so much, this incredible body of wisdom and knowledge, and all of my work in the part of my work that is in the arena of youth who've caused harm is, grounded on the work that James and his people have done, and so many others. So it's really just an honor both to be here and to be here with James. So I was incredibly grateful for my time at the Mesa Refuge, and my time there really let me get started on this book that I'm writing. And so the book is about forgiveness, and it is about my forgiving my father, who sexually abused me throughout my childhood, and specifically about the advice that I received from His Holiness the Dalai Lama when I was 24 years old and living in India and doing some work there around intimate partner and sexual violence and trafficking. And when I thought about this moment in time, I was exceptionally ambivalent about reading from this book. And my reason for that is this. My reason for this ambivalence comes from the fact that whenever we are in this moment of awareness about the fact that lynching remains a thing in the United States, it's never not been for hundreds of years, and yet at these moments when they're filmed, when our eyes are opened, one of the next things that happens pretty quickly is the way that particularly the media and others look to the African American community for signs of forgiveness, for public expressions of forgiveness. Both Jean's brother hugging the police officer who killed him in his home, the 9 the church community in Charleston and the expressions of forgiveness after 9 people were slaughtered praying in their church. These moments, to my mind, use forgiveness as a spiritual bypass, where we're looking for absolution for our histories and present realities of white supremacy and structural oppression. And so, I really thought about my book, and I thought, should I really be reading from this right now? First of all, it's quite unfinished, and the parts that are finished just didn't seem on point for this moment. So, but then I started thinking more about the book and about about really one of the most important pieces of the advice that I received from His Holiness when I met with him when I was 24 years old at his residence in in Dharamshala. It's actually called MacLeod Gunj, where he is. And when I was pressing him for advice about how it is that I might forgive my father for the sexual abuse I endured, he wouldn't give me a formula for forgiveness. And for quite some time, His Holiness was sort of deflecting. And then ultimately, when I kept asking, he asked me the most powerful question I've ever been asked. And it was, do you feel you've been angry long enough? Do you feel you've been angry long enough? And so to my mind, sort of the punchline of the book, but there's more to it than that. I think that we need to sit with this question when we have this rush to forgiveness and absolution. I still stand by the fact that my own forgiveness of my father was beneficial for me. That releasing myself from the anger that I continue to care for him is actually what allows me to stay in this work of ending mass criminalization. But I also think that it was too soon to sort of read the forgiveness parts of the book. So when I hopped on Facebook this morning, I saw a post from Tarana Burke, and it literally changed my mood significantly. And what it was a picture of her and 3 other Black women on a Zoom call. It was a screenshot. And, I know Tarana is deep in thinking right now about the nexus of Me Too and the call for Black Lives Matter's significant change that's happening in the movement for Black lives. And what I loved about this photo was that all 4 of these women were smiling from ear to ear, just so beautifully. And it said, you can't steal our joy. You can't steal our joy. And so I started thinking about, the world that we're trying to build requires creating joy and maintaining our joy and holding on to our joy. And so I decided, instead of reading the forgiveness parts of my book, to read a very brief part of something that I have sketched out here from a more joyful part of my book. And so it's joyful within the context of suffering, right? So I'm going to read a little bit about how I landed in MacLeod Gunj in Dharamshala, which is where the Tibetan community in exile lives. And I was living in Mumbai, then called Bombay at the time, and working with trafficking survivors and trying to work with trafficking survivors, helping my then boyfriend try to build a program there. And I had a total and complete breakdown. I was non-functional for many months, barely holding myself together. And my rage was really killing me. And I'm not entirely sure, to this day, I'm still excavating how it is that I ended up getting on a train and a bus by myself at the age of 24, surely to the horror of my family had they known I was doing these sorts of things back then. And went backpacking by myself in the Himalaya and landed in Dharamshala. And so this is just a little bit about just getting off this bus that had broken down multiple times, having been many people trying to convince me not to do this along the way, and sort of arriving very roughly at the front door of a guest house in this tiny town. That is nothing like the Dharamshala of today. It was really peaceful and quiet back then. And so this is just a little bit of a reading from that part. I was met at the door by a man who I later learned was the guest house owner. When I handed him my US passport to register, He looked up from his registry book at me with his head cocked sideways and curious eyes. "But looking Indian," he proclaimed. I'd heard this countless times since arriving in India, and I was tired of explaining, so I just nodded silently and looked away. I came here to get away from being American, from being Indian, from being lousy at being either of those things. He inquired no further and asked if I could pay 30 rupees a night. I said I could only afford 20 because that's what it said in my outdated copy of Lonely Planet, India, and I was nearly out of money. He reluctantly accepted under the condition that I tell no one else that he had made this concession. "A bucket of water, hot water, would be an extra 5 rupees, he said, as he led me to the basement of the inn his family was building. The heavy wooden cots were completely flush against one another, making 2 rows of continuous beds with a long pathway at their feet. He told me he'd recently acquired them from a local army camp. Multicolored paksa blankets made of heavy patchwork yak wool were neatly folded at the foot of each bed. Still not trusting my stomach after the hairpin turns that ended my bus journey, I skipped dinner and chose a bed that didn't seem to be claimed on either side by fellow travelers, climbed into it, and experienced the deepest sleep I'd had in months. I woke in the middle of the pitch black night to the gentle snoring of what seemed to be an older man right next to me, but I was strangely fearless. I was deeply grateful for any source of heat in the ice cold of that March Himalayan night. Feeling a deep sense of calm and joy, the source of which left me curious, I drifted back into dreamless sleep. At 7 a.m, I was poked awake by my toasty dorm mate, an ancient-looking monk from Ladakh in deep maroon robes, offering me a cup of butter tea and a small piece of rock-hard yak cheese. He had cavernous lines around his twinkling eyes and a playful grin. Just looking at him made me smile back. His attendant told me in broken English that they thought I'd slept too long and that it was time for me to get up and pray. It became clear that the older monk was the teacher of the other 4 who were traveling with him. To me, he looked at least 120 years old. Ut, ka, get up, eat, he insisted, and poked at me and laughed out loud. He pointed at my hair and wanted to know why I was so unkempt for an Indian girl. I touched the back of my head and realized I hadn't brushed it in days. A loaf-like matted lock had started to form. As if this would somehow explain my ragged appearance, I explained in my broken, overly formal Hindi, "Mera mata pita Indian, lekin main America mein paida. Bachpan se main America mein rehte." My parents are Indian, but I was born in America. Since childhood, I live in America. Upon hearing this, he doubled over in peals of laughter, as if I'd told him the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Was he laughing about my identity, my lousy Hindi, or the way I looked? People joking about any of those things were touchy spots for me, but I felt no malice in his laughter. It was infectious, and I joined in. His kind, smiling eyes somehow cast migration stories in a new way for me. With him, I could giggle, not cry, that my Indian body had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, that Ladakhi monks were traveling to Dharamshala to receive teachings from a great exiled Tibetan leader, that the convergence of these things meant that we were sitting in a basement dormitory of a Himalayan guest house, drinking butter tea and eating yak cheese together as the sun rose. Thank you.
Hi, this is Susan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, hi Byron.
Hi. How are you?
Hi, little glitch there. Thank you, Sujatha. I love that reminder that in the midst of all this, there is also joy. You were so wonderful with that perspective. So thank you. You chose well for today. Up next is Byron Hurt. Byron is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, a lecturer, a writer, and a speaker, especially in the area of gender violence. His documentary, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhythms, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was broadcast on PBS through Independent Lens. His other work has been featured on MSNBC, CNN, MTV, and even Fox News. So Byron is somebody who regularly reaches millions of viewers. He may be unique among the Mesa alums in being a former Northeastern University football quarterback. He's a founding member of the Mentors in Violence Prevention program, the leading college-based rape and domestic violence prevention initiative for college and professional athletes. And because of his films and his work in gender violence prevention work, he is very often invited to speak on hundreds of campuses. And in fact, the lockdown has been really unusual for him because he's been at home rather than on the road. Recently, he's been filmmaker in residence at American University, and he's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University in the Journalism School of Documentary Film. He's a consultant for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Forward Promise Initiative, a storytelling project for boys and young men of color. And when Byron was here, he was working on his upcoming film called Hazing, which I'm very intrigued with, and I've been following ever since I heard about it. So Byron, welcome back to the Mesa.
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you and hello to all of your attendees who are viewing this Zoom call this afternoon and this evening on the East Coast. First, before I begin, I want to acknowledge you, Susan, and Kamala, and also Kyra and Elaine for creating such an incredible space for creators like myself to share our work and share a bit of our process. This has been very powerful for me thus far, and I want to thank Elaine for setting the tone with such a powerful opening. And then also James for your deeply honest and deeply genuine statement about the state of things as it relates to the recent police violence and police murders of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and the latest victim who was murdered last night in Atlanta. Thank you for just being honest because it created a space for me to be in the right frame of mind because the last several weeks have been very heavy on my mind and on my heart. And to Sujatha, your writing is beautiful, and I thank you for sharing a piece of your story and your life. So my name is Byron, and I am a documentary filmmaker, and I'm currently working on a film about the culture of hazing in America. And my experience coming out to the Mesa Refuge was nothing but beautiful and welcoming and powerful in terms of what it was able to do for me as a creative person, as a thinker, and as a writer and a filmmaker. When I came out to the Mesa, I was overwhelmed by work and having traversed the country, back and forth and up and down, giving presentations and showing parts of my films at colleges and high schools around the country. Visiting the Mesa was a welcomed and needed reprieve from the hectic schedule that I lived. And so for the first week All I remember is that it rained almost every day for about 5 days or so, maybe more than that, which gave me the time that I needed to just relax and take a deep breath and just rejuvenate myself. And then when the sun came out, I was able to capture and see the beauty of the mesa and all of the nature that surrounds it. And from that point, the writing started to flow for my documentary, which is a first-person documentary. So I decided that I'm going to show you a bit of my film, which is still in the rough cut form. So it is rough, and it's not a finished version. But I want to give you a sense of some of the writing of my narration, which began at the Mesa and has now made it into the rough cut version of the film. The clip that you're about to see is, it features one of my participants. She is a mother who lost her daughter tragically to a drowning due to hazing activities. And she has become one of the strongest participants and characters in our film. And she has a very strong voice. So you're going to hear a little bit of my writing into her introduction, and then hearing her story. Again, I just want to warn you that this is a rough cut. There's nothing final in this film, and just please be forgiving if it doesn't look perfect. The graphic design is not finished. The audio is not mixed, none of that stuff. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and I'm going to share with you a clip from my rough cut hazing. The year after Robert and George died, there were 9 hazing deaths.
Tonight in the drinking death of a local teen at a Fresno State fraternity.
He wanted to be accepted. He wanted to be liked. The price that was put on it was to have to go through this ritual.
On the one hand, I love my fraternity brothers. I'm committed to my fraternity. But I can't ignore these tragedies that continue to occur. Hazing doesn't just affect men. It affects women as well. One story that I discovered in my research that really impacted me involved 2 women who tragically drowned while pledging a sorority that I know and love. One of the women left behind a 2-year-old son. As a father of a daughter myself, her story really hit home.
Listen, I want you to be safe this Labor Day weekend, so put this number in your phone, 1-800-HURT-123.
I headed to LA to meet Kristen's mom, Patricia Strong Fargus, affectionately known as Pastor Pat. I interviewed her as she drove a car that in a small way keeps the memory of her daughter alive.
I got this car through Let's Make a Deal with Wayne Brady.
Let's make a deal. Hello, sister. Where are you from?
I'm from Los Angeles. I'm actually a pastor. The game we played was big.
According to Guinness,
The end of the question was
the greatest number of lightning strikes survived by a single person in one lifetime. 7.
and I knew that because when Kristen went off to school, she called me and said, Mom, I got struck by lightning. And so we looked it up and I said, look how many people, 2 or 3 people have been struck by lightning. And she said, I'm serious. I got a burn in this coat.
Hey, get your car. Baby.
Kristen was like an angel looking over me when the car moved. She's always looking over me.
How often do you think about this?
I think of Kristen almost every day of my life. I wonder what she would be doing now if she'd be working with me because we were so much alike. I read a book when I was cleaning her room out, and in there she says, I'm going to own a nightclub, and it's going to be called The Loft, taking Skylar to his softball games and basketball games. So she had a lot of dreams.
What can happen this Labor Day weekend? Most of the time it's people who are going to the beach.
Powerful waves pulled 22-year-old Kristen high under as she struggled to save a friend, 24-year-old Kenitha Safir, from that same rough surf. High's mother says the girls had been brought to this spot as part of weeks of initiation rituals for the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. At times, she says, the girls would be blindfolded, had their hands tied, and were pushed into the water during exhausting exercises.
Thinking about 16 years ago that I could have had my daughter is hard.
Police say the case remains open, but they've seen no evidence of hazing. They call it an accident.
The sorority covered up the truth, and I don't really know what happened to my daughter, nor Kenitha. It's just been washed under the rug. The question comes up with me all the time. What is hazing? A New York fire department. I was terrified that a fellow firefighter would rape him in order to haze him. Football player beaten in vicious hazing caught in video. Kansas cheerleader punished for alleged naked hazing incident. Parents of a fraternity pledge sue after son hazing death. Growing hazing controversy.
Hazing is any behavior to join or maintain membership in an organization that humiliates, degrades, abuses, or endangers someone regardless of their willingness to participate. And that's the piece that oftentimes people don't understand.
I remember when this video came out and people clowned former New York Giants player Princeton Mukamura, even though he was a second-year player.
It was very obvious he did not find what was happening to him funny. The fact that he's a second-year player, I would think really speaks also to the definition of hazing, that it's not just about joining, but it's about maintaining membership.
I know about hazing in sports. I played football since I was 7 years old and experienced hazing in high school. And while it was humiliating and embarrassing, I never saw it as a big deal.
An alleged hazing at a football camp that the women's look.
So that is one small portion of my film, Hazing, which is intended to be a PBS broadcast. The full length of the film is going to be 90 minutes long. And so we're still on the path of completing the film. And we're hoping that this is a film that's going to make a tremendous impact and that becomes a tool that can be used for people who do anti-hazing work to, change the culture of hazing so that these violent deaths stop happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Byron. What a powerful moment in your film. I'm sure it's, I can't wait to see all of it, and I'm so happy that you were able to start writing it at Mesa. I also really appreciate that you explained about how you were working on it and that it was a rough cut and how you started writing it, because I think for people who are interested in Mesa, it's really fascinating for all of us to hear about people's writing processes and what you discovered in your own mind when you had the time and space at Mesa. So thank you for coming to Mesa, and thank you for sharing this part of your film. Our next reader, our last reader, will be Reb Irwin Keller. Irwin, can you turn on your audio and video? Reb Irwin Keller was in residence at Mesa in 2016. He is a spiritual leader, a performer, an activist, a lawyer, and a former drag queen with the renowned group, the Kinsey Six. He is currently the spiritual leader of the Kotati-based congregation Ner Shalom and a founder of One Soul, an initiative of the Interfaith Council of Sonoma County, working to defend the rights and dignity of the Muslim community and others under threat. As an attorney, Irwin authored Chicago's 1989 Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Ordinance, one of the first in the country, and served as staff attorney and executive director of the AIDS Legal Referral Panel in the San Francisco Bay Area. I am fortunate, and I give thanks to Zoom actually, for being able to meet Erwin through Yiddish Tish, which is a weekly Yiddish literary group that I was only able to join because of Zoom, because it's based in Katahdin, where he gives us work from the proletarian poets and shares Yiddish anti-fascist songs. My mom used to say that a Reb, when you call someone a Reb, it meant somebody who had studied a lot in the Talmud and so knew how to answer all your questions. So I will happily turn it over to the wise and witty Reb Erwin Keller.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I wish I were only able to answer a few of the questions. Byron, that was incredible. And when you said it was rough, I know you were talking about the filmmaking, but that subject matter was really rough, and I'm struggling to collect myself. I think right now we're all experiencing so many layers of grief that even seeing that little clip of the film opens up the floodgates, and so much pours in our grief about our personal losses and about George Floyd and all of the people of color who have been victims of police violence, and it all pours in at once. So I'll try to pull myself back together. I'm honored to be on this panel with these writers who are such amazing visionaries and leaders, and who bring so much to the public in a really broad way and a really wide way. And I, at this point in my life, having put the wig and the pumps back in the closet, I am a country preacher at this point. So what I'm going to share is an excerpt actually of a drash of a sermon from a week ago, and it's sort of my attempt to try to bring the Jewish people who read what I write and who attend our synagogue into a greater understanding of where we all sit as Jews within the struggle for racial justice, and make that connection between sort of the global and the personal, because I think we need to always make sure that we land in the personal in order to stay in integrity in how we engage with any social struggle. So this was a piece called "To Breathe Free." Give me your tired, your poor, says our Statue of Liberty, lip-syncing the words of Sephardic American poet Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. In 1883, when Lazarus wrote these words of welcome to future immigrants, I am not sure what breathing free in America meant, and I am not sure what it means today. In 1883, the emancipation of Black people from slavery was only 20 years old. Were all Americans breathing easier? Were former slaves breathing free? The yoke of slavery had given way to the chokehold of racist terror. From emancipation to the 1960s, thousands of Black Americans were killed by lynching. Millions more were suppressed by the threat of it, by the very specific threat to the ability to breathe free. So when a white cop in Minneapolis kneels on the neck of a subdued Black man until the life is out of him, it is not and can never be about one bad actor and one innocent victim. It is a calling forth of a centuries-old effort to suppress the breath, to suppress the spirit of a people. Black people, including Black Jews, know this without having to think about it. And more white people are knowing it through tragedy after tragedy, murder after murder. Maybe sitting for months confined within a pandemic, staring down a disease that can put you on a ventilator, wearing masks that strain the breath. Maybe this too is helping white people know it on a visceral level as we look to find our place within this struggle. We Jews are everywhere in this story, playing all sorts of parts intentionally and unintentionally. Many of us Jews are people of color and are identified first that way wherever we go. Others of us look white and have varying degrees of white privilege. For many of us, our Ashkenazi grandparents left a European world where they were people of color, persecuted and perpetually seen as alien. And they came over on ships, yearning to breathe free. They tossed their tefillin overboard, along with their languages, rituals, and personal histories. They watched over generations of children and grandchildren and saw their Yiddishkeit dwindle to punchlines and stereotypes. They had succeeded more than they intended. They had sacrificed their particularity so that we could be Americans, by which we now understand, so we could be white. And that has been our history as white Jews in this country, not knowing if we are majority or minority, powerful or powerless, exploitive or exploited for our convenient position in the middle of it all. We toy with privilege, we eschew it, and we benefit from it. We are embarrassed by it, and I know I have felt safe within it. But we have relearned in a very short period of time that safety is illusory, and our whiteness, for those of us who look white, remains provisional. We learned it in Pittsburgh. We learned it in Charlottesville. We have been reminded of it by Breitbart and the Daily Stormer, by this president's White House staffing, and by sly tweets referencing George Soros. We learned it in the first weeks of this epidemic, when our synagogue's Zoom room was taken over by white supremacists, calling us by name and spewing racist and anti-Semitic taunts, which they saw no need to distinguish from each other. So we know now, we really do know, if we didn't know it before, that our fate is tied to the fate of communities of color. It is for all of our sakes that we need to be at the barricades, that we need to give money to Black candidates and to Black Lives Matter. We need to lift up Jews of color who are more and more the future of our people, which means we light-skinned Jews stop asking them how they became Jewish. Our tribe needs to be big and expansive and inclusive of all of us who are called to be part of the Jewish and the Jewish people. And we Jewish and Jewish people need to be part of the bigger tribe of brave souls who will put this monster of white supremacy out of its misery at last. But marching and giving are not enough. We have a task, at least those of us who read and live as white, which is to dissimulate, to unlearn all the lessons that whiteness has taught us about who we see and who we don't see, whose life matters more and whose less, whose stories get told and whose ideas are listened to, who we encourage, who we delight in, and in whose creativity we take pride, whose breath is essential. In Hebrew, the word for soul is the same as the word for breath. So let us, with each breath, feel the soul of all people. Breathe for and with communities of color, holding them as our companions, allies, teachers, and leaders. Feeling their lungs as well as our own, let us notice every breath, the centrality of it, and the privilege of it. And together may we all, at long last, breathe free.
Thank you so much, Erwin. That was so beautiful. Thank you for answering some very difficult questions and raising some more difficult ones. It was beautiful. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask all of our panelists to come back into the gathering room. James, Sujatha, Byron, and Erwin, please stay with us. Is everybody there? Thank you. And Kamala, can people see all the panelists? I'm not sure. And Susan, can you join us as well? We have a few minutes. There were some comments and questions. Most of the questions, most of the comments were really powerful thank yous to all of you. Thank you to Sujatha and to Byron for sharing your personal stories. Thank you to James for such a profound analysis. And we hope that that essay will be widely read. Thank you to Byron and Sujatha for your vulnerability and willingness to share your in-progress work. I wonder if the panelists would, oh, and there was a wonderful question which Byron actually answered, which is, could this film be required reading for high school students and college students? And Byron, I will read your answer. One of my goals is to make this film required viewing for students, high school and up. Erwin, thank you for connecting our different struggles and stories. So these are the comments from our wonderful attendees. And I would like to ask you all if you have comments or questions for each other. And why don't we start with James?
I have a million questions for the panelists, but I will just give a comment in terms of this. Whenever we talk about this moment, I get very nervous. And so one of the things that I would suggest is that, you know, this work around equity and inclusion is not done with a soundtrack in deference to Byron, and because we want soundtracks in our films, but life actually doesn't come with a soundtrack. And oftentimes it's quiet and it isn't, big newsworthy. And so I would invite all of us in this time to actually not take the easy targets. President Trump is such an easy target and we can all have so much fun, but actually, what's happening in your local police commission? Who's running for sheriff locally where you are? Who's your district attorney? Who's your public defender? What's your police budget? So all of these things happen close to home and they often aren't reported on. And so I would just say, take this moment's energy and not only read and educate ourselves, but involve ourselves in that kind of what seems to be boring work of your local community and how it is that they take our dollars and our permission to do what needs to be done. And the only other comment I'll have to my colleagues is I just am thrilled that Mesa gave me an opportunity to go there and take away time from my life to write. I got more done there before or since. And it is really, it's a blessing in disguise that there's no Wi-Fi and the printer's janky and all that kind of stuff. And so it just gave me a fantastic opportunity. And just being with these colleagues that have been there continues to give me that spirit. And so thank you guys for putting on this event and going ahead with it virtually. It all matters.
Thank you so much, James. And actually, one of the comments was, and you answered it without even knowing, was one of our listeners was very intrigued by Byron's discussion about his residency experience. So if in your closing comments, if you want to say anything about what you did at Mesa, that would be great too. Sujatha?
So maybe it's been a while, James. When I was at Mesa, the internet was actually working quite well, maybe too well. So, but I just echo that I got, so much done there. I finished a chapter and a half, and I put out a piece in Vox while I was there, and I've never been so productive on the page. I've been to one other writing retreat since at a different writing retreat, and it really is these kinds of nurturing spaces that allow this. It's a time that we're just not given, and so it's just really a blessing. So Byron, I was really moved by your offering a rough cut, and I was super nervous about reading today because this is. First of all, it's my first book. It's new. I don't do this, and there's just this invitation to offer in the same way that we would have in that gathering room. It's just, I love that you've all done the best that can possibly be done through this format to recreate that feeling. And Susan, seeing the backdrop of your scene really helps us feel like we're there. And it is in that, like, the grappling, right, in the working it out, in the figuring out what goes before what. I think that's a really beautiful metaphor for where we are in this moment, and an agreement that a moment is not all of it, as James, I think, is pointing out so beautifully. And I think one of the personal takeaways for me today, Erwin, was when you were talking about provisional whiteness. And that just, it really, like, when you get those goosebumps, when you're like, oh, there's something in there for me personally to lean into. And just Saturday, I was listening to Tenmuri Soundarajan, who's a Dalit activist, brilliant person with Equality Labs, really pushing those of us who are Savarna, people of caste, from the South Asian subcontinent, to think very closely about why it is that we are all so comfortable making noise about Black Lives Matters when we haven't done the same thing for Dalit and Bahujan lives back in South Asia, and what relative privilege I carry both within my own historical and cultural background, and what it means for us to excavate that, right? And so this real question that I'm being pressed with around white adjacency, which I think is something that South Asians are very good at, and what it means that race obviously is a fiction. And at some point, my Irish American husband's family was not white here. Greeks were not white here. Like, when do we become white, and what is happening to the South Asian community with that in regard to that? And so really, like, when we leave adjacency to whiteness, we adopt provisional whiteness. And that was an incredible teaching for me today. So really, thank you. Those words will stay with me for a long time.
Thank you, Sujatha. Byron, would you like to add a closing thought?
Well, I'm actually heartened today by the conversation and by the voices in this space. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's been a very difficult 3 to 4 months in this country. And I would extend that beyond this country and say globally. But here in the United States, as a Black man who's married to a Black woman and who has a young Black girl, it has become more clear than ever before that we are dealing with multiple pandemics in this country. And we need to continue to fight against all of the various systems and mechanisms and levers that hold white supremacy in place and makes it possible for the kind of police murders and other abuses that have taken place in this country for centuries. So it feels freeing to be in this space, to be able to give voice to that, and to hear people speaking powerfully to some of the issues of the day. And so I feel very thankful to be here with you. And I guess my only piece of advice to piggyback off of what James said just a few moments ago is that there are activists and freedom fighters who have been working on these issues for decades. And I would just encourage people that if you have a newfound interest in these issues, to seek out the people who have been doing the work, the organizations that have the cultural competency and the experience and the know-how, and to support them in any way that you can, whether it's providing your labor, using yourself as a shield against white supremacy, or providing money or other resources to be of assistance, but to seek out the organizations and the people who have the know-how and who have been on the ground doing the work for a long time. I've been a long-time activist in addition to being a filmmaker, and I see film as a tool, an educational tool to get people to have hard conversations and to advance the work of other activists who are doing work in the areas that my films address. So I just encourage people to use your voice, use your platform. You may not be a writer or a filmmaker, but you do have some agency to change the culture that we live in.
Thank you so much, Byron. I hope we can all take that advice to heart. Erwin, can I ask you for some closing thoughts?
So, amen, Byron. First off, gratitude to Mesa Refuge. My residency was a few years ago, and it was it was terrible. It was terrible in a good way. I mean, it was having to face how difficult it is for me to write when I don't have the specific thing and the specific deadline, and feeling like this is my chance. This is, and having to stare down all of that expansiveness and try to get work done was just a terrifying thing. The result of that was a story that ended up becoming a TEDx talk, and that was and that really came out of my time at the Mesa. So I'm grateful for the generosity of having that space and that view and that freedom and that encouragement and that nurturing that made something come out of me despite my best efforts. One of the things that really touched me was at the end of Sujatha's story about the sort of the conflation of circumstances, that these very, very different roads bring people together at these moments, and being able to find the surprise and the delight in being in that moment. And again, using the word moment in a technical way here. And I think there's something that I want to encourage all of us to see, and how it is that we all end up being here on this Zoom call today, or how we end up all being at a particular march, or how we all happen to find ourselves in community for change, or in community for transformation. And we end up being there at the same time, and the different roads that got us there. And that even in times that are so trying and painful, that we find that delight in seeing each other and that sense of purpose that brought us all there. And I know other people have written about this, and the Clarissa Pinkola Estes essay about you were born for these times. But I do find this encouraging, that we're all here and that we're talking to each other and we're finding each other, and these kinds of connections are being made all the time, and it's not an accident. It feels to me like on some cosmic level, it's not an accident. And so I just want to acknowledge the delight and the shared purpose that to me arise out of the conflation of all of our circumstances bringing us together.
Thank you so much, Erwin. And today's event was just amazing. I want to thank our panelists, James, Sujatha, Byron, Erwin, so much. You really are the ferocious people that James Baldwin invoked for us. And it was just wonderful to hear all your readings and your thoughts about the future. And it's just makes me feel so great about Mesa. And I know there's many people in the audience who are supporters and donors to Mesa. And it just, I think, makes us all feel great that we're able to build and sustain this place for voices like yours. So on behalf of Mesa Refuge, I thank you all. And I would like to turn the program back over to our wonderful executive director, Susan Tillett, for your words of wisdom, Susan.
Thank you, Elaine. This has been so wonderful. I feel like the house is smiling. It's been very sad for it to be locked up for months. And, we do all that we do so that you can be here and do all that you do. And we've had a little interruption in that, but your voices are all reverberating around the gathering room. I remember seeing each of you in this space when you were here with your other two residents, and it's wonderful to have you back. And we are so proud of you. We're so proud of the work that you're doing and the voices that you're raising. Elaine reminded me, traditionally at this event, which is the picnic, we celebrate victory for our spring fundraising campaign. And we are doubly blessed this year. We raised $100,000 for the Mesa Refuge, which is pretty remarkable given that we never were able to get together. The mail house went out of business, but we had a wonderful, mighty committee, and we had our 6 change makers who really personified the Mesa. And it was so heartening to see people step up at this difficult time and say, we want to know that you're going to be there when this is over. And so we will be. So thank you all for being with us today. It's really been wonderful. Take good care. Bye-bye.